Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to IoD National Webinar Conversation Series. I am your host. My name is Raj Singh. I chair the IoD Berkshire, and I also conduct this conversation series on a regular basis. Today's conversation is around how boards can work better in a chaotic world. And our guest today is Dr. Dambisa and Moyo. So first of all, thank you to all of you to giving up a lot of your time in the middle of a working week and a short working week in the UK, and also right in the middle of your normal day-to-day stuff. So thank you again. On behalf of Institute of Directors and all of you, let me welcome Dr. Dambisa Moyo. And Dambisa, a very warm welcome to IoD Conversation Series.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
And those of you who do not know, Dambisa is a resident of London, but right now she's in a better part of the world, which is California. So she is a native, and one of our regional chairs had a question for you, Dambisa, that after doing all of this, how do you find time to run a marathon? But I will leave that to be answered in the end.
Okay.
Because I can't see him here, but you need to answer that because he was very intrigued that you do all of this and you still run marathon. So we'll pick that up on a lighter note. But before I start this conversation, just to let you know that we are recording this conversation. If you have got any objections, please let it be known on the chat box. But we are recording this conversation purely for the benefit of others who could not make it today. So before I start this conversation, let me do a very brief welcome for Dambisa, because if I do a proper welcome, it will take all the 60 minutes. So let me keep it brief. Dr. Dambisa Moyo is a preeminent thinker who influences key decision makers in strategic investment and public policy space. And just to let you know, she did correct me that this is not uncommon, but I found it very uncommon because she got her first board position, in a publicly listed company at the age of 39. So that I have not seen in many of my guests, or actually none of them. So I really believe there is an incredible credibility and authenticity behind Dambisa as a professional. She is respected for a unique perspective, balance of contrarian thinking, with measured judgment, because contrarian thinking could be great, but if you are not moderate, then it does not get a lot of takers. And of course, she has a fantastic ability to turn economic insights into investable ideas, and that is how you find her in so many boards and advisory positions. She earned a strong reputation as a top-tier opinion former and trusted advisor on macroeconomics, geopolitics, technology, and millennium themes. She is a board member right now at the 3M Company, Chevron, and Condé Nast. Her previous board positions include SABMiller, Barclays, Seagate Technologies, Barrick Gold, and many others. Her latest book, How Boards Work and How They Can Work Better in a Chaotic World, was launched yesterday in the US, but Dambisa tells me today that it's getting launched today in the UK. So again, that's a bit of surprise for me, right till the last minute. So you are very lucky to have her on the day her book is getting launched. Dambisa is the author of 4 other New York Times best-selling books, and she has published in the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, Bloomberg, and many other reputed newspapers and magazines. She is an honorary fellow of the Foreign Policy Association and a member of the Bretton Woods Committee. And I must say that I really started thinking about getting Dambisa on this conversation by watching her so many times on Bloomberg. So if you are a Bloomberg regular watcher, Dambisa is not a new face. But Dambisa, again, thank you very much for accepting our proposal to be here for this conversation.
We're delighted to be here for the conversation. Thank you.
So when we get into the conversation, very quick thing to all of you. We will be having a moderated conversation for about till 2:30, 2:35, depending upon how the flow goes. And then the last leg is open for you. You will be required to put your question in the chat box with a prefix Q so that we know it is a question. And then what we will do is, we will take your questions in the order they come, and we'll try to finish by about 3 o'clock. 3 minutes or 4 minutes before the closing time, we will request you to come back with your video on, and then we can do an e-photograph of this conversation series, and with vote of thanks, we'll close. We'll try to keep it tight within the times. So now we get into the conversation, Dambisa, and as you know, we discussed about this before, but I think our audience would really like to know about your journey to being inside the boardroom for over a decade. How did you come into it, and how has it gone for you?
Well, again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm very much looking forward to conversation, and so that it doesn't sound like it's a speech. So please do prepare your questions, and if I say anything that you agree or disagree with, please don't hesitate to offer your perspective. I joined my first board around 12 years ago. And by that, I'm talking about large global complex organizations. I have been on boards across different jurisdictions in the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, as well as continental Europe. I've served on boards in different sectors and industries, so from consumer goods, banking, technology, energy, as well as media. And I have had an inordinate experiences in a range of different challenging environments, everything from, of course, COVID, but I had the death of a chairman while he was in office. I had a company acquired for $100 billion when we thought it wouldn't be bought. In fact, it was the second largest company in the industry. Was acquired for over $100 billion in 2016. The biggest transaction then, that was SAB Miller. I was the chairman of the risk committee, did not see that Brexit, not only that the vote would happen that year, but also that the vote would be to leave the EU, and that had a material impact on the valuation of the company at the time of the discussion, and we can chat about that. I've been on boards where we've had an activist in the stock. We've had assets expropriated by governments. I've been on a board where we've had to pay enormous regulatory fines. And I've been on board where the company, when I joined, had a share price of almost $60 a share. And because of a number of challenging issues, especially as a price taker, as a commodity company, the share price went down to $7. And believe me, it was very stressful. Fortunately, the company is still operating as a going concern, and the share price is back up over $20. But that's just really to provide you a bit of background in what I've been doing in the last 10 years. But also, I really want to stress that I am a somewhat unconventional board member. Not only because of, as Raj pointed out, my age at the time of my, when I first joined my first board, when I was 39, but also, of course, my race, being Black, coming from Africa, and also being a woman. I was just talking to someone today, the numbers have ticked up considerably, certainly in diversity. And today there's about 34% of FTSE boards now have are now women represented. A lot more work has to be done. We know about the Parker Review regarding ethnic minorities, and we should definitely talk about some of that. I will just say also, I was also an unconventional board member because I did not come from the C-suite. By that, I mean, I did not come from being chairman or CEO or a CFO of another large business. And look, I'm telling you a lot of things at the moment, just to give you some background context. You know, it was incredibly challenging for at least 5 years. I was rejected consistently by the search firms. You know, you may be surprised to learn that even to this day, I get rejected a lot by search firms because I don't still fit into that mold that I you know, of coming from the C-suite. And even to this day, I think a lot of companies, as I talk about in my book, still look for at least 40% of their board seats to go to people who have served either as a chief executive or as a CFO. Why don't I stop there? I know that was just about to give you a little bit about my journey. I'll just end off by saying I love my work. It's challenging, it is, and I know we're going to get into the conversation about how the board's role has evolved. The first board, and I talk again, this is a lot of this materials in my book, how boards work, but the first boards actually date back to the 1600s in the Bank of England. And it's fascinating. They had 24 board members. In that respect, you could argue that there have been a lot of changes, but fundamentally the fiduciary role, the custodial role, date back to many centuries. It's challenging work for sure. And I do have my pet peeves. I don't like board colleagues who jump off when trouble hits. And I do think that more and more the responsibility of corporations is becoming broader, as we know, especially since through the corporate code, as well as the business roundtable announcement. And that it brings a lot of opportunity, but a lot of challenge as well, because ultimately corporations and the boards that serve them are not elected to represent or act on behalf of society, but we are nevertheless, have an important role to play in making sure that all aspects of E, S, and G, environment, social, and governance are addressed. Let me stop there, Raj, and send it back to you.
No, thank you. In fact, I'm delighted to hear, about when you said that you got rejected for 5 years. And, if it gives you any kind of, similarity, our ex-chair, Charlotte, she told me once when I talked to her that, is it something that you should really work for? Because it seems to me it's very easy to come by once you have got the first one. And she said, believe me, I have been into 3 chair positions and 9 board positions. And still my success rate on getting a board position is 20-1. So join the club.
Yes, I think my mother says it's a little bit like having a boyfriend. If you have one, all of a sudden you have a lot of other interests. But it's how do you get the first one? I think I don't know if I'm even allowed to tell those kind of jokes in the sort of sensitive period we live in. But that's what I was told, and I think that's absolutely the truth. And I'll talk a bit more later about how it is I got into my first one. But go back to you, Raj.
So our audience is not really upper tight lips the way the phrase goes. So they are very jovial people, very open-hearted. They can take it right on their chin. So yeah, they are not typical London tube commuters, tight upper lip. So you can be as frank as you want. They will not get offended. So Dambisa, just to make sure that we get the best out of your time. First of all, what really made you write this book at all?
So I was driven by 2 things. One is, as someone who was born and raised in Africa, I always wanted to live in places like the West, Europe, the United States. And I was really always inspired by the fact that there was an understanding that corporations and companies have an important role to play in long-term economic success. They are important in terms of job creation, infrastructure, tax base, innovation, as we've just seen with vaccination, the vaccination rollout around COVID. And so I felt that this narrative has somehow gotten lost, and companies have been very, very criticized. Market capitalism in general is being criticized very aggressively. And so I thought primarily that this was an opportunity for me to reassert the important role that companies play, not just as they have in the past, and not just today, as being a sort of a partner and partner with government in trying to address a lot of the issues that the world is dealing with around COVID, but really an important partner for continual human progress going forward. So that was part 1. Part 2 was really, born out of surprise. I've done numerous seminars at top business schools, at Oxford, at London Business School, at Harvard, Stanford. And I was pretty surprised that business schools, but also investors, regulators, even my own employee base in companies where I served on the board, people just didn't know what the mandate of the board was. And they also didn't know what levers the board actually has to influence change. So it felt to me that it was important to really explain that the board has 3 responsibilities. It has to oversee strategy, not just for the short term, but also for the longer term. It was also very important for me to explain that a primary role is for us to hire, as well as in some cases, unfortunately, fire the CEO, who is more and more the standard bearer of a company's culture. And then thirdly, really the board had oversight, an important role to play around these big ESG issues, about the cultural sort of raison d'être of the company and corporate sort of a body politique. And so it felt to me that given the sort of anti-corporate, anti-capitalist sentiment, that this was an appropriate time to sort of revisit these issues and to sort of stamp the imprimatur of companies and their important role.
Thank you. I will not let it go so easily. So I'll bring you back to my previous conversation topic. You got your first role at the age of 39 in a publicly listed company. Please tell us the story behind it. A lot of people in this room would like to be inspired by that, the way you got it. There was definitely a structure behind it.
Yes, and you know, I think it's an interesting story, and I do hope that people who have unconventional backgrounds like myself maybe will take heart that this is something that's possible. I was incredibly lucky because, as I mentioned, for at least half a decade, I got a lot of no's, and very often with no explanation. So I kept sending in my CV, and you know, I'd hear nothing, or I'd be told, oh, you know, it's not quite right, but nobody really had the temerity to say, listen, you know, woman, you're not eligible, because we didn't really see where you could add value to the organization. And I think that that's partly the onus, if I may take some agency, I think partly the onus was on myself. I wasn't really articulating, using the language that a company would, you know, be able to identify how I could add value, not just to the board at its macro level, but to the board committees, the audit committee, the compensation committee, the nominations and governance committee, the committees that were focused on risk. And so I think I learned that lexicon much better after I wrote my first book, Dead Aid, which came out in 2009. And I won't, you know, sugarcoat it. The reality is, you know, that was a real a lucky break in that I was able to have a specific thing to point to, which was an articulation of clear thought leadership. But beyond that, I think I was also super lucky because companies had decided to start widening the aperture on how they sourced board members. So this notion that they were only going to go for CEOs and CFOs started to peter out, because if you remember, 2008, we're in the middle of a financial crisis, and people started to get more interested in broader geopolitical themes, issues around technology, and the ongoing issues as we know today around climate change, you know, digitization, etc., remain top of mind. So, you know, even at 39, you know, I will, and then maybe this is the last really critical point. At 39, I still had to do a lot of packaging to explain why I could add value. But I think most critically, I was successful because the boards that I initially joined, SAB Miller, as well as Barclays, had a large emerging market footprint, and they happened to be looking for somebody who could fit that bill. But there's no doubt about it that my network played an important role. I had happened to know a couple of people who, you know, or essentially decided, hey, you know, we read your book, thought it was really interesting. This board is working on these exact issues. You know, why don't you interview for a board seat? And I thought, how is this possible? But my point is that it didn't come through the search firms. It had to come through my network. And in that respect, I think that it was much more an unconventional sort of approach to the boardroom.
Thank you. So we got a clue now. We have to write a couple of books before we get considered for a board position.
I'm sure not.
Is the boardroom composition of today fit for purpose for the future, especially around this rapid cycle of disruptive changes? When we see every board, you know, is full of legal professionals, finance professionals, corporate governance. Is the composition really fit for purpose for next 10 years?
So it's a wonderful question, and even with respect to ESG, which is sort of the sort of thing in vogue at the moment, I'm very, very sensitive to making sure that whatever boards do, We're building frameworks and guardrails that are flexible to adapt to the changes that are happening around us so rapidly. 6 months ago, I serve on the board of a couple of American companies. 6 months ago, we did not at all think that we would today have to deal with issues around voter turnout, issues around the sort of discriminatory aspects. I mean, a lot of these issues we thought, well, this is government work. So in that respect, if I didn't anticipate having to deal with those types of issues 6 months ago, I need a system of thinking that's transparent, that's consistent, that's sustainable, and also dynamic, that I know that in 6 months' time, whatever the company is going to face, it will be able to think through and use good judgment to land on our decisions. It is absolutely the case that the world is moving rapidly in all manner of areas. It's not just about environmental change and climate issues. It's not just about race and gender issues around equity. It's about worker advocacy, so workers becoming much more vocal, wanting to have a seat at the table. It's about data privacy. It's about the rise of China, digitization. And so when you say, are the boards fit for purpose, all those elements need to be covered. And I think for me, an additional piece that we have tended to overlook, both in terms of recruiting the CEO, but also thinking about the management of the company, is ethics. How do we actually imbue our thinking on the question of ethics? And I'll just leave you with this point that in 18 months, over 400 chief executives, as well as senior leaders lost their jobs because of the Me Too sort of stance and campaign. And to me, that signals that we need to do much better in terms of recruiting and thinking about how we recruit. It's not just about how good are they financially and operationally, or in terms of being a great leader. All those things matter, absolutely. But we do need that additional layer of thinking about going beyond references and really probing into people's ethical and moral compass. When I was on the board of Barclays, I had 4 CEOs in about 6 years. High turnover, 3 chairmen during that period. It's a lot of a transition for an organization to face. And that was obviously a more internal thing. But as I mentioned a moment ago, we are in a world of enormous change that we have to adapt to. The one quote I like around this is something that Jack Welch, the former and now late CEO, chairman of GE, he said, when the rate of change outside is faster than the rate of change inside, you're dead.
Thank you. That's a lovely note. We'll make a note of it and quote you when we re-quote it somewhere else.
Sure, he said it more eloquently, but that was the main message in it.
There has been significant noise around corporations, and as you said, the negative news gets the audience, and that is how it fuels itself. But still, I really like our audiences to know on your views. How do you see the importance of corporations going forward, who have been damned so much in the last 1.5 years?
Yes, and I think it's hugely important, more than we can, really anticipate. If I can just give some statistics and then maybe talk a lot about the challenges that I think we face. So in terms of statistics, I was just reading a report that comes out of Fortune magazine. The top and this, by the way, is broadly true in the UK as well. I don't have UK statistics that are analogous, but it's the same principle. The top Fortune 500 companies in the United States, their revenues are 2/3. That's over 66% of the US GDP. So US GDP is over 20 trillion. I mean, they are generating huge revenues. Those companies are also responsible for employing 30 million people around the world. In my book, Edge of Chaos, that I published in 2018, I was shocked to find out that Walmart is the 3rd largest employer in the world. So you have the US government, especially the Defense Department, the Chinese government, their Defense Department, and then number 3 was Walmart with over 1 million. I think it was at that time about 1.2 million employees. So in terms of taxes and job creation, I mentioned innovation, infrastructure, which by the way is graded D+ in the United States. I mean, this is just not a formula for success. More and more government is leaning on corporations to step up in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, mental care, as well as helping out to build, digitize and upgrade the sort of network system. The reason I think this is incredibly challenging is that not only are we expected to do our day job, which is traditionally been the primacy of shareholders, but now we have a big agenda which has required that we broaden the utility function around a list of areas that I touched on earlier, things like, and I'll just give you some examples of the trade-offs that we have to deal with. On the one hand, I happen, by the way, to serve on the Oxford University Endowment Investment Committee. So we are under immense pressure by the student body, by professors, don't invest in hydrocarbons or fossil fuel companies. And I serve on the board of a large global fossil fuel company. And I hear their arguments very clearly. People are worried about climate change, but we cannot get into a situation where we're thinking only to defund those companies without recognizing that there are 1.5 billion people around the world who have got no access to energy in an affordable and sustainable way. That is a material problem. Energy poverty is creating big problems today. People cannot just dial into a Zoom call easily, but it is really setting people on a very, very poor trajectory going forward. So that's one example. Another quick example is that the data is absolutely in. It's very clear that diversity helps you become more competitive. Companies that are diverse in the boardroom, in the C-suite, in their workforce, they do better. The return on equity is better. The return on invested capital is better. And there's a lot of this data I put into the book. But we cannot justifiably fight discrimination with discrimination. So I'm very sensitive to make sure that I don't want to lose the high-performing white guy because somehow they're worried that the narrative is now saying they're no longer wanted. So again, there are these trade-offs and this balancing act that companies need to think about. I'll say one last thing on this, which is a broader point. And by the way, I've given you just 2 examples. There are many other examples in the book. In the West, we love our work-life balance. In China, people are willing to work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. How should we think as a global business? How do we square that circle? You try to impose Western values in China. Not only do the employees revolt, but also consumers say, what are you doing? Why are you bringing your best values here? And it's also vice versa. But the point is that there are lots of examples in the book around this. I think one point I really want to stress, though, is whatever we're doing and whatever challenges companies face, we realize that risk mitigation is critical. We need to think about mitigating for those downside risks. So in climate change, we want to reduce the CO2 emissions, greenhouse gases, water intensity, etc. But we have to also think about upside opportunity and leverage. Companies cannot shrink their way to growth. So we have to think about, as board members and senior executives, how we convert the narrative so that it absolutely focuses on these risk items, but also focuses on upside opportunity. That's the only way we're going to drive human progress more and more around the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's not my story today, but I cannot resist this one. I was as a part of Norwegian Indian Corporation mission long back, some 15 years back, and the finance minister of India was there. We went to the Nobel Institute for a lecture, and one bright student, straightway first question right out of the book says, "Tell me, what are you doing about pollution control in India? You are the second largest economy. And what are you doing about this hydrocarbon and everything else?" And of course, he also put it more eloquently, but his message was very simple. For 50 years, you grew your economy by doing the same thing that we are doing right now. Now that we are catching up with you, you want us to bow down. Exactly. By taking care of hydrocarbon. Not that I agree with his statement, but again, it's a contrarian point of view. And so, yeah. Your talks remind me of so many things, which great people have said before. So thank you for that. But to stay on track, I cannot really stop asking this. This I have to ask you. You have been in a board where an activist investor came in and they tried to disrupt the whole strategy of the company itself. What clue and guides you will give us, because you are in a hot seat at that point of time?
Yeah. So look, I think that the main thing that I've seen over the past decade that has changed is that boards are more alive to the need to prepare for these sort of insurgents of activists. And very often activists, they think they have the full picture, but sometimes they don't. By that, I mean that, you have 12 people ordinarily in a boardroom who, especially in the UK context, where it's a unitary board, as you know, but you do have really, I think, very good working tensions between the chairman and the rest of the non-execs versus the management team. And that's an important relationship because it does constantly, in a way. I remember one of my CEOs in the UK said, "Oh, I don't need to worry about outside activists because I have activists right here in my boardroom." That role of check and challenge is very much embedded in the UK approach to managing from the board, and I think that's an important piece. What I was going to say is that over the past 10 years, one of the things that companies are doing is more and more doing what simply called red versus green scenarios, where they're saying, okay, we think and we have signed on to this annual report because we believe this is how the world is today. But what if we're wrong? What if people have a completely different view about whether the company should be one company? What are the regulatory risks? What are what kind of investments is the CEO making that might be right or wrong? So that to me has been a big shift in terms of how we think about strategy. Once a year, as you know, we have strategy meetings. I think that in the past, strategy meetings have tended to lean towards, a presentation by management, and that we react to that. But now they're moving much more into, well, this is my presentation. Here are the pros and here are the cons in a much more aggressive and sort of clearly outlined way. And I think that is an artifact of the world of activists. I don't think all activists are bad. I talk about activism in general, and there are many scenarios where activists have ended up on boards and they've been highly constructive, but they do take up a lot of mind share and can be somewhat frustrating if they're not willing or they don't have the full facts before they sort of launch a public campaign. So I think that there might be scope for better discussion around how they can play a role in these companies.
Thank you. I will now go to our colleagues' questions because they are just pouring in. But I couldn't resist asking you that question, so I took a bit time. But the first question comes from a colleague, Sebastian Gray, and Sebastian is asking, have you found your network or search firms? I think what he means is which one of them you find to be the most valuable through your career in being chosen to the board? Search firms or network?
So for me, definitely network. However, as you may be aware, there's basically, I don't know if I wouldn't call it a law, but there's basically a sense now, best practice, that companies should not staff boardrooms without using search firms. And I think that the motivation for that from the regulators is to create more of a level playing field. Because if it really is all chummy network, then, people like myself would have no shots in hell. I'm not on the golf greens and I wouldn't have the opportunity to be on boards. That being said, I have to skew my efforts to being in networks. And when I say networks, I'm talking about, as somebody who did not grow up in the UK, a lot of the non-executive programs that are offered by the search firms, funny enough, but also the large accounting firms, really getting experience that way, but also really building up a body of experience that even if it's in school governance or hospitals or museums, etc., showing that you have a good understanding of the complexity of overseeing a complex organization. And by the way, I think NGOs have a much more complex agenda item with a lot of vested interests and more constraints than even a sort of a listed company. But nevertheless, I think that there are other pathways that are quite attractive to businesses now. As I said, academe. Obviously, right now, everybody's obsessed about having scientists and technologists and people with a great geopolitical perspective. Especially in the US, they love having people who have been in government to help understand that perspective. So this is the time, as I said, that the apertures widen quite considerably. As I said, the search firms are kind of a necessary evil because they still need to do the background checks and do reference checking, etc. So it's really important that they know who you are as well.
Richard Mabry is asking that in addition to the contents of your book, which of course got read and you got your first position, other than that, what specific skill sets do you think you were recruited for in the beginning of your career? Right now, that is not a question at all, because right now everyone knows you, they'll be queuing up to hire you. So that's a different issue.
It's still a question, though. It is. So for me, it was definitely around risk. I spent 10 years at just under 10 years at Goldman Sachs. I had grown up on the trading floor there. My PhD is on macroeconomics. I basically focused on global trends. So I was able to articulate myself as being somebody who's very interested and worked in risk. And perhaps no surprises, I ended up, as I said, chairman of the SAB Miller CARAC, which is basically the Risk Assurance Committee. And I've also ended up in a lot of audit committees, which, audit in its pure sense tends to have focus on controls and being backward looking, and they love accountants and auditors. But a lot of audit committees also have that element of looking to the future with that risk element. So for me, that was definitely the thing that people found appealing. No surprises. I think I have served on remuneration as well as governance as well, but really by and large, people, I look at your resume, I know that you're risk or audit, and that's what's tended to define my career.
You have already answered the question of one of our colleagues, Miles Hill, so I'll come to that maybe in the end if you have time. But Nigel is asking, would you support placing more emphasis on underlying patterns of behavior, talents, beliefs, in relation to the selection of board members versus prior job title, experience, and all those standard stereotype board skills?
Yes, I think, and that was the point I was intimating around ethics. I don't think it's either or. I think what I'm suggesting is it needs to be additive. We do a lot of work around mental testing, a lot of the sort of what I call financial and operational rigors to test CEOs as well as board members, but we don't do that much work around ethics. And I think behavioral work, and if I may just to maybe take a moment to say that for me, when people say what is the most important skill a board member should have, for me it's judgment. Someone told me a long time ago, leave your ideology at the door, and I think it's a really good point. You need to be, you're going to be in a team of 12 people who come with their own baggage, their own life experiences. But most, in that forum, none of you have experienced whatever it might be, whether it's COVID or a financial crisis, etc. And what you don't want is to have people who are slamming their fists on the desk saying, this is exactly how it has to be on this whole range of issues that we've gone through. We want people who have got strong views, but are willing to listen and form good judgments, sometimes really in a negotiated way. In fact, the problem is that judgment doesn't scale, but also, I can't tell you, go and take this wonderful course at London School of Economics on judgment. I mean, that is really the issue. It's the most valuable piece of a successful board member, I believe. But it's exactly the piece that is hard or virtually impossible to test. I don't know where to do that. And I think it's a learned muscle. I think looking at complex problems and realizing that it could be challenging is really important. In fact, one of my favorite quotes is something that President Obama said. He said when he was president, by the time something entered his in tray, I think he meant his mailbox or his inbox, it meant it was something that was extremely difficult, because if it were easy, somebody else would solve it. And that's exactly true with boards. By the time something comes to the boardroom, it means it's extremely difficult. If it were easy, somebody else would solve it. And I think coming to those types of problems with aspects around ethics and, a rigor, of course, of conventional expertise, but on top of that, ethics, moral compass, good judgment is somewhere I think we need a lot more emphasis.
Saeed is asking if, not Saeed actually, it is the previous colleague. So Don is asking, if you were to talk to your 20-year-old self, what advice would you provide to her now that you have set out on a very, very, of course, lucrative and successful career path?
It's such a wonderful question because I, in 2000 and I think it was 2010, it was my first annual general meeting for Barclays. And we had a board meeting, an AGM meeting. We had an enormous number of shareholders showed up. Obviously, it was financial crisis, LIBOR. So you can imagine we had 3,000, massive number of people at Royal Festival Hall. And I was for the first time on the podium with my fellow board members. I was the only visibly minority or ethnic minority on the board. I was the only woman, and I was the only Black person or anyone of Asian or other ethnicity. And midway through during Q&A, one shareholder put their hand up. By the way, this story is in the book as well. But the chairman said, yes, your question. And the person very aggressively pointed at me and said, I want to know what that board member's statutory credentials are. The statutory board member's credentials are that she should be allowed to sit on this board. And it was deeply embarrassing. But at the same time, I derived a lot of sort of pride that I had spent a lot of time, at the coalface trying to build myself to be a butcher, a baker, or a candlestick maker, or in this case as an economist, because I felt it was a defensible position. I'd worked in the city for 10 years. I had written books. I had done a lot of work on risk assessment that was relevant to the company. So if I were looking back at my 20-year-old self, I would say you need to do more of that. You never, ever want to be in a position where someone could actually humiliate you in that regard because of them making assumptions about why you might be on the board. And it was quite funny because when I was coming off of the podium and we were leaving at the end of the meeting, 3 of my board colleagues came up to me and said, oh, thank God they didn't ask about me because my credentials I would have fallen flat. And it was funny because, they were sort of the quintessential great white guy, but everyone assumed that they must be sort of equipped to be on the board. But in my case, for a whole list of reasons, they assumed that I shouldn't be there or that I had to justify my existence. So 20-year-old self, it's a tough world. You need to constantly refresh your credentials. And I say refresh because I think this is all about continuous learning. As I said, the issues that we're facing today, we didn't expect 6 months ago. I'm sitting here alive to the world's changes, and I don't know what we're going to be dealing with in 6 months. So you have to be a constant learner and prepare yourself for skeptics.
You know what? It's very wise word that you gave to all the younger generation. And we do have aspirant directors within our membership. But you remind me of JP Morgan chair. Again, I'm giving a lot of publicity to Bloomberg, but unfortunately it was again from there. JP Morgan chair was asked just about 2 months back on a morning breakfast questioning, what will be your advice to the people who are right now studying or just looking for a job? He says, the only one message that I can give them is work hard, and you have to work hard to get somewhere.
Absolutely right.
And it was so powerful. So it's good to hear the same coming from you, because many a times we start taking role models from 1 in a million people who made it very big with reasonable hard work, but not a very, very big hard work. But what we don't realize is they're only 1 in a million or maybe even more.
Yes,
so
and I just one other quick point on that. I think the world has become so fractured, as we know. I mean, for me, just 2 points. I think very quickly. Firstly, I could not be where I am now without the support of people who look like me, but a lot of people who don't look like me. And I've realized that it's really important first, just to understand that no doesn't mean never. It just means not now. So there are many things where, years go by and I'm like, oh, I keep trying to get this and it's not happening. And then something happens. And I think just because somebody keeps telling you no, it doesn't mean that's not going to happen. And what I think our duty is to get more information about how you can become better equipped or a better candidate, and instead of getting frustrated or assuming it's some other reason that you're not getting something. And I think also just related to that is that we've gotten to a culture, and I think a lot of companies say, oh, we're going to give you a mentor, we're going to give you feedback, but we're in such a fractured world right now that the people giving feedback are scared. Oh gosh, if I give this Black woman feedback to tell her that she sucks in marketing, is she going to sue me? Is she going, and that is very hard for not only somebody like me who needs that feedback in order to get better, but it's also must be very hard for the person who is a manager or feels like they want to give that feedback. So to me, I think another piece of advice is I take the view I am not entitled to any feedback. I like receiving feedback, but I'm not entitled to it. And so I really foster a culture where whatever the person I hope will give me feedback looks like, white guy, Black woman, whatever, I try to make sure that they feel comfortable enough that they can give me critical feedback that I desperately need. You're not going to succeed without that. And I think that we miss that a lot in a world where people have now been scared into their corners. So send somebody that, even if you disagree with them, send them a box of chocolates and say, hey, thanks, I appreciate what you said.
So Michael is asking a question that if you consider governments to be almost like the board for the people they represent, that is the country's board, what will be your advice? How do you bring more ethical behavior in these government positions, which are almost like, in his parlance, a board for the country?
Yes, I'm actually involved in one. I'm on the non-executive board of the Department of Investment and Trade, and it's absolutely clear that the mandate, again, for something like a civil society organization or government is much broader. There are lots of other levers, lots of other vested interests. But I've always been struck by something Mike Bloomberg said, interestingly enough, when he was the mayor of New York. He said a government needs to be four things. It needs to be data-driven. It needs to be forward-leaning. It needs to be using measured outcomes, and it has to be not corrupt. And I think it sounds pretty simple, but actually, if government works at that efficient level, really, especially in a time like now, let's look at the data. Let's stop assuming things. Let's not build in emotion without understanding. Looks at forward leaning. Where's the world going? Not where the world is at the moment, but how are we investing for the future? Thinking about measuring outcomes so that we can get sort of do better, and then also not being corrupt. I think that those are the elements that we should hold, government positions at the highest level to that. And when I'm doing interviews for government positions, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for people who are data driven, measured outcomes, etc.
Alison is asking a question that please share about the most effective board assessment and development processes that you participated in or personally led.
So we get assessed every year, as you know, not just publicly by shareholders who put their hands up and maybe even insult you, but also, we obviously go through an election process. But more and more over my tenure, over a decade, the conversation has definitely moved more towards 360 reviews, where boards are not just reviewed from an outside consultant who says, I'm going to absorb how you guys are interacting at the boardroom. But they're also saying, well, wait a second, Dambisa, what do you think about Raj? And Raj, what do you think about Dambisa? Is this an effective director? And then finally, it's also about a lot of assessments now do assessments of the board's relationship with the management team. It's a critical piece. If the management team doesn't think you're adding value, then why are you taking up that seat? In fact, someone said to me, people say, oh, I want to be on a board, but they never ask the question, who from management is going to call me when there's an issue? And I think it's a really important sort of guideline, because it's very easy to say, oh, I'm going to be on a board, but I feel uncomfortable if I'm not getting a phone call from somebody in either CEO, CFO, somebody running a business to say, hey, I just wanted to run something by you, or can you help me think through some of these issues? And I think that that's an important layer to the question. So all these are part of the assessment. The assessments are very dynamic. and they are becoming, much more. I would say that more and more we're trying to bring in the perspective of other stakeholders as well, as we engage, obviously at a much lower level, but with institutional investors, with stakeholders. I mean, I did a lot of work with NGOs directly when I was chair of the risk committee at SAB. So I think it's a dynamic process, but those are some big pillars of the 360, the outside, and looking at a board versus management are all key aspects of the assessments.
I'll keep the golden question for the last, as I promised, because now Faisal has joined the question queue, but he doesn't know that I already told you I'll be asking that in the end. But before I go there, we have got a couple of minutes more. So I would like to squeeze in one question. That's around, people believe that the board sets the strategy, but many a times, unless you are a veteran board member like you, we do not understand what are the challenges the board faces in setting a strategy, both from inside as well as outside. It's not an easy job, is it?
It's not an easy job at all. And as I said, and actually one of my board colleagues used to say to me, he's now 83, and he still says to me, Dambisa, I can tell you, we're always going to be surprised. You're always going to be surprised. Nobody expects the financial crisis. Nobody expects COVID. Nobody expects Donald Trump to win. Every single time you're going to be surprised. And the thing about human nature is that we are surprised. You're like, oh my gosh, I didn't see that. And the trick is to have institutions that can bear the sort of the shock of risks and the shock of uncertainty, good or bad, in a way that they can still operate as a going concern without sort of saying, oh gosh, this has happened. And it's about those tail risks. It's about those things that are hard to anticipate. And I think that that's really in a world which is becoming more deglobalized. China is rising. Issues around immigration are becoming hot. Technology is dominating. The green agenda and energy transition have become huge. All these things are things that are appending how we think about boards and corporations, and therefore we require an upgrade of boards as well.
You know what? It's always never to leave a guest without asking the golden nuggets. So what are the 3, 4, 5 critical issues no board should ignore? I know there's a chapter in the book about this, but we'd like to hear it from you.
Yes, there's a chapter in the book that is basically targeting people who are already board members, and I'm saying, hey, listen here, these are the issues right now that are coming. I like Wayne Gretzky, the former hockey player from Canada, because he always says, when they asked him, why did you always win? He said, because I always thought about where the puck was going. I did not where it was, but where it was going. And so that chapter 4 of the book is really trying to say, here is a bunch of things. This is where the world is going. In no particular order, I talk about the more deglobalized world, more balkanized world. Obviously, Brexit has happened. We're no longer part of the European Union, but the world is becoming more fractured and more balkanized. How do you think about supply chains and trade in that environment? A second issue is about institutional investors. We know about the move from active to passive. Today, the large institutional investors like BlackRock, like State Street, like Vanguard, they own about 20% of every large company in the United States. Huge implications for M&A, conflicts of interest, etc., that have to be discussed and thought about, and also their influence and power in shaping the board agenda and the corporation's agenda vis-a-vis the sort of retail investor. A third issue is technology and digitization. And as I said, it's not just about risk mitigation around cyber. It's about how are we going to use technology to make us better, to help us compete. Thinking about issues around provenance. And so, hey, there's going to be much more information about just, picking up your mobile phone. You'll be able to say, wait a second, I can now swipe over a steak in a restaurant and it will tell me how much CO2 was emitted, how much water was used, how much the average wages in the restaurant or in the company that produced the steak. The use of technology is not just downside, but upside. So I talk about that. And then the last two are about the war for talent. We are in a very anti-immigration world, it feels to me. How does a global business recruit or even think about staffing in a world where we are much more fractured and we can't recruit that easily? The last point, which is in a way is an umbrella point, is about short-termism. We know this topic very, very well, not just in the private sector, but the public sector as well. We reward politicians for thinking short-term, but all these big issues from technology, demographics, inequality, climate change. These are long-term structural challenges. So how do we think about that in a world that has become more short-term, but we've got all these big long-term structural problems. So that's a quick menu. I go into more detail in the book.
So now comes the golden question. Despite working so hard to achieve so many things in such a short time, how do you also find time to run a marathon?
So what I will say about the marathons, I've been very fortunate. I've run 2 London marathons, which I loved, and 2 in New York. I'm registered to run another one this November. Hopefully my knees will hold up. I'm now over 50, so it's a bit rough. But I will say that I want to just put it in context. Although I was born and raised in Africa, my times are nowhere near the best African runners, and usually I find myself at the back. So yes, you can give me credit for finishing the marathon, but my times are so bad that I think my parents, who came to see me run the last London marathon in 2019, I think it was my father made a quip about he wasn't even sure if it was really running a marathon and how much time they waited for me to show up at the finish line. So it's doable, but it just depends on maybe sort of reducing my expectations about how long it will take me to get to the finish line.
So, Dambisa, thank you ever so much for coming to our conversation series. It's really greatly appreciated. We know it is the first day of your launch of the book and the tight schedule is there. But again, I think the least that I can do is thank you from the bottom of our heart from Institute of Directors.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed being here, and the questions were very interesting, and I hope to be able to see you in a different context soon.
Before I bring this to close, I would like to thank my colleagues, Julie, who is not here, Juliet, who is here. They are the people who make this happen. So thank you, Julie and Juliet, for making this happen. Thank you to our lovely audience who has found time in the middle of a working day and a short week to come here. But before I bring it to a formal close, could I request all of you to come on video, and then we can just take a quick digital photograph, which could be a souvenir. And of course, we will share that with Dambisa as well.
Thank you.
So give me a couple of minutes because everyone will not fit into this screen. So I may have to take a couple of them. So bear with me for a couple of minutes, but we will finish within a minute. Thank you. That's all. Thank you, Dambisa, and all the very best with the next interviews and the meetings. And thank you, my colleagues. Have a lovely afternoon and a very good day.